Welcome to Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs in Miami. I'm David Kramer, Senior Fellow with the Green School, and want to welcome you to this webinar series brought to you by the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series. Today's subject, global inequalities, is not a new theme. Simply resulting from the pandemic, inequality has been with us for centuries. While there has been considerable progress in certain areas, we still have a really long way to go to treat people equally. In the US and elsewhere around the world, we see huge disparities between rich and poor, between and among different ethnic and religious groups, in gender and on climate. COVID-19 has had an overwhelming and disproportionate impact on marginalized people throughout the world and here at home. Why is that? Indeed, COVID-19 has intersected with and amplified systemic racism, gender inequality, protracted conflicts, poor governance, and underdevelopment, exacerbating vulnerabilities even further. The world's attention seems more attuned to these inequalities than any time in recent memory. How can we turn this new attention into positive action to address these problems? Here to discuss these issues, we have a terrific panel with us. Kevin Grove is Associate Professor in FIU's Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies. Matthew Marr is also an Associate Professor in FIU's Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies and Asian Studies program. Andrea Quealy, Associate Professor in FIU's Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies, is also with the African and African Diaspora Studies program. And last but not least, Suzanne Swingle, Associate Professor in FIU's Department of Politics and International Relations. And let me just say, I regret that Professor Danielle Cleland was not able to join us as originally listed on the program due to an unexpected issue that came up today. So let's jump right into it. And Professor Quealy, Andrea, if I may, let me start with you. Racism, of course, is one of the most glaring and obvious inequalities. In yesterday's teach-in that FIU hosted, you used a phrase that really struck me, the casualness of racism. Can you elaborate on that?
There I go. Okay. I was just thanking you for the invitation to participate in this panel and just saying hello to my co-panelists, and I'm excited about this conversation. So to answer your question, so yesterday in that panel on racial inequality, or that Black Humanity Matters, actually was the title of the panel, that I said that in the context of looking at and discussing the incident of the killing of George Floyd, and that I remarked that one of the remarkable aspects of that I think has really rocked people is the casualness, as you said, with which the officer is murdering him, and signified by his hand in his pocket, you know, and that he's on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and I link that really to this impulse that's threaded throughout U.S. society, certainly in other places that in the Americas and around the globe that have histories of colonization and enslavement, where there's a devaluation and a dehumanization of specifically Africans and people of African ancestry, and that part of what has happened historically and what we continue to see the legacy of is the kind of disregard, right? And a kind of not just desensitization, but an almost amusement, right, with the spectacle of Black death and suffering. So, and there's, you know, I think I mentioned yesterday Saidiya Hartman's work on 19th century America and the ways in which the Black bodies were essentially spectacles, and the ways in which torture was yoked with amusement, you know. So I think that we need to look at these kind of deeper reasons and deeper patterns that contribute to these inequalities, racial inequalities that, you know, again, have to do with processes of dehumanization within the project of white supremacy.
And do you think that the attention that really has come to bear in light of the tragedy with the police murder of George Floyd, do you think does this feel different to you this time? Sadly, there have been tragedies like George Floyd in the past. I dare say, unfortunately, there will likely be others in the future. But do you feel like we're at a different moment right now?
Yeah, I actually, I am cautiously optimistic. um, I do think, I mean, we're in the long game. This is myself, my colleagues, we've talked about this. So, and I've thought a lot about what is different now. I think that there's a kind of several factors that make this particular moment different. Um, One is that, we see things occur in cycles, but I think of spiral, right? And I'm hoping that the spiral is going upwards, meaning into greater light. And that the confluence of the coronavirus and the lockdown, the the video of his murder, as you said, we've seen videos of other murders. So what makes this different? That also came out at the same time. Yeah, I think it was how many weeks after the murder of Aubrey came to light, right, in Georgia, that he was just running and just got chased down by three men and murdered, and they were never, at that point, it took weeks and weeks for them to actually be charged with anything. And then you had the incident with Amy Cooper in Central Park, right? With Amy and Christian Cooper, Amy Cooper, the woman who kind of the white woman who manufactured this hysteria, called the police on the black man who was a bird watcher, actually asking her to leash her dog. And I think that this is a particular moment where people are speaking about systemic inequality as opposed to this kind of rhetoric around bad apples and how do we kind of improve policing. So there are different questions I think are being asked in the mainstream. I mean, these questions have always been asked and advocated for, but I feel like it's much more, just much more in the mainstream.
Great, thank you very much. Professor
Mhm.
Grove, let me turn to you. You have talked about in conversation we had before this session that the pandemic has highlighted the privileges of whiteness. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, definitely. And thanks, David, and thanks for the invitation. Thanks everyone for taking time out of your Friday to take part in this, important conversation. When thinking through sort of the privileges of whiteness, I mean, I'm from Ohio originally, and so when those anti-lockdown protests started occurring, well, it seems like years ago now, but a few weeks ago, I was horrified, but I followed on those very closely. And while I was watching what was playing out in Ohio, I was also deep into reading Frank Wilderson's fantastic new book called Afro-Pessimism. And I think it was interesting to juxtapose those two things because in his book, in his Afro-Pessimism book, Wilderson hits on discussions in critical race theory about the links between anti-Black violence and the privileges of whiteness, and it really kind of resonates with a lot of what Andrea was just saying. And so when we think about whiteness here, it's important to recognize that we're not talking about ethnicity or phenotype or biology, this sense of things. If we think about whiteness in those terms, it naturalizes race. And what's important is that we draw on sort of work from critical race theory and critical race studies that approaches whiteness and Blackness, but whiteness in particular, it's a structural position within white supremacist societies and a structural position of hierarchical privilege within white supremacist societies. And so what defines this structural position of whiteness is the expectation that you can and you will make a claim on the future. You can, will, and should act out the world according to your individual will and desire. And that people who are non-white, and especially people who are designated as Black, become instruments in the realization of your desire and pleasure. This is exactly what Andrea was talking about earlier with reference to Saidiya Hartman's work, where Hartman details how the privileges of whiteness have been defined by what privileges, expectations, and benefits can be denied to people marked as Black. And so Blackness here, just as whiteness is not, sort of doesn't refer to ethnicity, so too does Blackness not refer to ethnicity. It's a paradigmatic position of what you could think of as ontological objection, sort of a dehumanized, instrumentalized life, an object in others' world-making projects. And so when we think of whiteness in this way, whiteness and the privilege of whiteness is the privilege to make a claim on the future. And this claim on the future is created through the denial of futurity to non-white, Black, and Indigenous peoples. And it's the demand that's backed by the threat of physical violence and death to serve the whims and pleasures of white identifying subjects. And then as Andrea was mentioning, oftentimes these images of Black suffering and Black death become a source of pleasure in and of themselves. And that's part of the privilege of whiteness as well. So going back to the pandemic protests now, in those anti-lockdown protests, as a structural position within white supremacist societies, what defines the privileges of whiteness is always going to be historically and geographically specific. So I think an important question today becomes, how is the pandemic, sort of transforming the privileged and expectations of whiteness? And so here, work by authors like Wilderson and Hartman and others writing in the critical race theory tradition are essential because they help us understand that these protests that feature angry, armed, gun-toting, spittle-flying white folk, holding signs reading, "I need a haircut, I want a haircut, don't cancel my golf season, massage is essential," and on and on and on. These scenes repeat and recalibrate the structure of white privilege and the founding anti-Black violence of white supremacy. And so this repetition of anti-Black violence is what Christina Sharp calls living in the wake of the plantation, where historical forms of violence against people marked as Black repeat themselves in the present day in new forms. And so these protests then, they show how the pandemic response implicitly challenged white privilege in a way that triggered folks whose sense of identity and self-worth is defined by their ability to claim the privileges of whiteness, to act out their desires at their pleasure, at time and place of their choosing, unimpeded by concerns for others' well-being. And what the lockdown did and what the lockdown regulations did, it placed a limit on your desire, your pleasure. We're not allowed to go out and do things. We have to wear a mask, avoid crowded areas. And this isn't just to protect you yourself, but it's to protect others. And in particular, it's meant to protect those who are most susceptible to the disease. And as we're getting more and more data on COVID-19's public health impacts, we're seeing more and more clearly that the most vulnerable among the population are predominantly the elderly and impoverished working class, and especially minority individuals and communities. And so the health and well-being of non-white and Black folks now, through these lockdown regulations, presents a limit on white desire. And this is an implicit inversion of 400 years of white privilege. In white supremacist societies, Black death is not an impediment to white desire. It's what actually facilitates white desire. It facilitates white pleasure. And this is what the COVID-19 public health regulations are implicitly challenging. And so it's significant then that these anti-lockdown protests began as more and more public health data showed that minority communities had the greatest risk of death, and that asking people to forego stuff like haircuts and massages and going out to the golf course and stuff like that, this was meant to prevent death and harm to minority communities. And this is when you began to see sort of right-wing racist social media posts, beginning to trump up these sort of, anti-lockdown protests and promote anti-lockdown sort of violence. And so in this sense, sort of reopening the economy then presents a health risk to minority communities, as we know. And yet, at the same time, the lockdown was meant to precisely to prevent this kind of damage, public health damage to minority communities. And so this limit that the public health concern placed on white privilege was met by a panicked white response, an attempt to reassert white privilege by forcing the economy back open. And so the demand to limit desire and pleasure, to forego haircuts, movies, golf, massages, this triggered psychologically fragile white identifying populations. Those folks whose sense of self-worth depends on being able to racially differentiate themselves from those who cannot do as they please. And so these anti-lockdown demands to reopen the economy so that white identifying folks can get their haircuts, can go to bars, can go to nail salons. This repeats the 400-year demand for Black death at the service of white pleasure.
So let me ask you, pre-pandemic, this privilege of whiteness, had we seen progress in the years before, or was this something that was building up that is now sort of gone beyond the surface in light of the pandemic and frustration of the shutdowns?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think this is where, the work of critical race theory is so important, because the work of scholars like Christina Sharp and others, they really draw out that this is what makes white supremacist societies tick, and this is what sort of American society has been premised on. What we're seeing now is that we're seeing like this ugly face of white privilege. What white privilege actually means, when you get down to it, white privilege means others are at your instrumental disposal, even to the extent of sort of physical harm, torture, suffering, death. That's what a white supremacist society means, and this has been. This is the way that plantation societies were organized in the days of colonial slavery. The techniques of defining and asserting white privilege and ensuring and securing white privilege have morphed, and they've been recalibrated in response to new kinds of sort of social and political and cultural contexts. And yet we still see repeating in different forms, this demand for Black death as the measure of white privilege. And so what we're seeing now is just the latest iteration in 400 years. But as Andrea was saying, we've been seeing, a response to this demand and this violent reassertion of white privilege. We've been seeing a qualitatively new kind of response to this that we haven't been seeing in the past. And so I think, we're seeing both the ugly face of what white privilege actually means in sort of public health terms, and we're seeing people actually sort of taking this up and challenging it in new ways that in new ways that haven't been done before.
Before I turn to Professor Zwingle, let me just let the viewers know that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We welcome any questions or comments there, and we will do our best in the second part of this webinar to address and answer your questions. Suzanne, let me turn to you next and ask you the extent and degree to which the pandemic has heightened issues involving inequality on gender issues, if you could address that.
Thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me to this already very exciting conversation. Actually, the two speakers that came before me have already used a few terms that I also was planning to use, for example, devaluation and privilege and so forth. And so I think we think about this situation from sort of different angles and sort of meet somewhere. And so let me braid a sort of a gender perspective in there as well. When I think about gender, and I think of myself as a transnational, intersectional feminist thinker, kind of, again, it's, I think Andrea said something similar. It's not about an essential attribute that people have. And I think Kevin also said something like that. But it's really about, we're talking about a relationship in society, which is really, well, it's influenced by many other dimensions as well, race, of course, ability, sexual orientation, and so forth. And the point is that sort of we're not talking about one person that has a gender, but how gender relations shape how we approach things, how privileges are distributed, right? So if you talk about privilege on the one hand, we can also talk about discrimination and devaluation on the other hand. So we have these things hang together. We cannot think about discrimination, gender discrimination, race-based discrimination, if not also thinking about privilege on the other side. I think that's sort of important to have in mind, this sort of relationship character. The COVID-19 crisis, I think, so in sort of the global transnational debates about this, I think there have been a few relatively prominent sort of gender-based sort of observations. One was, for example, I'm sure you have heard this across the time, that the situation of lockdown is one where domestic violence, gender-based violence in the home becomes much more problematic because there's much less space to escape and to sort of deal with this in getting help from other spaces. There was also often a observation about leadership, gender-based leadership, where we have some leadership constellations where gender issues are sort of taken into consideration and sometimes not at all. And also, of course, we always see that as a tendency, women versus men, women are economically and materially oftentimes much more vulnerable than men because oftentimes they earn less, oftentimes they are employed in more precarious situations, and of course, oftentimes they do much, the sort of the bulk of unpaid labor, of family labor and care labor. And of course, in this situation also, where we have come to see healthcare work, right, which is sort of the backbone of our societies, really, but it's oftentimes not in the spotlight. Right now, it has become sort of essential labor. We look at that in a very different way, and this is, of course, one type of labor that is predominantly performed by women. So on the global level, it's like 70% of healthcare workers are women in a way. And I have looked into several statements and of feminist organizations around the globe and what kind of sense they want to make out of this situation. And I think the claim that I've heard the most often, and that I also agree with that, is to say, okay, we see in the COVID-19 pandemic situation, we see hierarchies and inequalities exacerbated, right? We have talked about this, the panel has this already announced, sort of cumulative vulnerabilities versus privileges. We see that, and of course they are gendered. I think it's really important to first stop and pause and realize how we have taken those hierarchies and those piled upon vulnerabilities as a normal situation. This is sort of seems to be the normal thing, and I think we have to really rethink how we live, how we organize our societies, and how we can maybe denormalize those hierarchies and refocus in a way. And one proposal would be to really think about the way we organize our material life in a very different way. Right now we have a very competitive capitalist economy. And how about if we focused more on building a care economy, an economy where nobody's left behind, where we think more about the well-being of everybody, so that everybody is good enough versus someone is the most competitive and most exciting player, and who he or she gets all the spotlight. I mean, I think you can imagine some players who would fit that description. Right? They seem to be always the winners in our imaginary, and so that the feminist perspective would say that let's look a little bit more about all this usually invisible, and undervalued work, or unvalued work, often unpaid work, that is actually the most important for us as a collective, as humans, really, to survive in the world, right? And well, you could say this is maybe a general point, but I think it has sort of a feminist twist, because of course we know that the division of labor is very gendered, right? That we have a lot of care labor, whether paid or unpaid, is performed by women. As I said, sometimes, oftentimes we have sort of it normalized that this work is either unpaid or very lowly paid, right? So that's the situation right now, would be to think how, is that a chance to say, well, we have done this, right? Because we have taken the luxury and to say this work is less valuable than, for example, being a stockbroker, or being a police officer, or being a university professor, right? But this work is actually what we all need, what we need on a very basic level to function. And I think we have to, oftentimes we have a discourse where we say, like, we have to get women, for example, in order to overcome the gender pay gap in the STEM fields because they are better paid. But I think we actually have to rethink what is highly valued and what's lowly valued, and why that is so deeply gendered. And if you let me, just one quick example to sort of make this a little more specific. I mean, you have probably often heard about this figure of that single mom that works 3 jobs in order to get the kids through school and so forth, right? And this is, of course, individually a very heroic tale. But I think at least on 3 levels, there's something wrong with that, okay? Number one, if you raise a family on your own, why can you not find a job that pays enough that to provide for the family? Why does this person have to find 3 probably relatively precarious jobs? Number one. Number two, this person is overworking themselves, and probably with that compromises their health and shortens their life, right? Because oftentimes they don't have healthcare insurance either. So how is that okay, right? And number three, why is the raising children, why is that not considered a job? That is in itself already a job. This is actually 4 jobs. So this person is doing too many things at a level where they are not valued for what they're doing, and they're doing it not only for their private, entertainment, but this is sort of socially important work that is just structurally constantly undervalued. And I think I would really hope so much that we move from here to re-see that. And of course, this is very much intertwined with race, right? Because women of color are the ones who are most devalued in that kind of situation.
So Suzanne, let me ask you one follow-up question. As you look around the globe at countries that have responded effectively and quickly to the pandemic, I can think of 3 off the top of my head, Taiwan, New Zealand, and Germany, that have handled this quite well. And all 3 have women in the top political positions. Does that make a difference, do you think, in terms of how leaderships and countries approach handling a crisis like this?
Not essentially. Not like you put a woman on top, you got the solution. That would be great. No, I think it has a lot to do with much broader structures. Okay, in many of those countries, it's not that you have one woman who's a leader, but you have a strong representation of not just white male parliamentarians, for example, in parliament. So you have a large share of diversity, a large representation of diversity in political decision making, much more broadly speaking, right? I think that's important. That sort of helps to articulate many more needs that are out there, right? And then I guess there's a case to be made that women have less to lose in a way in terms of gender stereotypes when they display collaborative leadership. When men do that, I think oftentimes they are very afraid that they look weak. And for women, this is much more in line with their with what's expected of them, right? And of course, individually, I think all of these leaders are just really very breathtaking leaders, right? It's not only gender, obviously.
Great, thanks. Let me turn to Professor Marr and Matt. Let me get at issues of inequality when it comes to rich versus poor, better off and those less off. When authorities call for shelter in place, that obviously is impossible for some people to do, either because they're homeless or live in very densely populated conditions. There are large segments of the population for whom mitigation efforts are virtually impossible. How do we address that issue?
Thank you, David, and thank you to all the organizers in SEPA and the other panelists and the audience for coming out today. My research is mostly on homelessness in the US and in Japan. So when we're talking about homelessness in the United States, I think really need to point out that it is a problem of racial inequality. And in Miami, the Miami-Dade general population is 17% Black, but the point in time population, the percentage of the point in time population in the county that is Black is 60%. So we have a big jump there. They're just African Americans in Miami-Dade County are definitely become homeless at higher rates than other racial and ethnic groups. And then when you look at families, that number jumps up to 70%, and youth, the number is 71%. So, a lot of times people understand homelessness as through a lens of looking at the individuals and the problems or the individual deficits that folks have. But I think it should be understood as a deep structural problem rooted in wide inequality, like the lack of affordable housing, the lack of living wage employment, the lack of safety net, social safety net protections, but also even deeper than that, like residential segregation, educational inequality, the failed war on drugs, all of these things together generates a whole set of problems, and homelessness is one that is really visible. Another thing I want to point out is that a lot of policymakers tend to look at homelessness in static terms, like, okay, how many homeless people do we have in Miami? Point in time counts for the last 10 years are pretty steady at about 3,000 people in shelters and around 1,500 people or so on the streets. And so a lot of times policymakers will say, okay, so how much money would it cost to put those people in housing? And oftentimes some more callous policymakers are thinking, oh, we can send them to Homestead and put them in a dorm or something like that. But that's ignoring the fact that our social structural system is constantly churning out people that are vulnerable to homelessness, and people are flowing in and out. And so it's not a static problem. So these are two key points that often get misunderstood. But now to turn a little bit to the intersection with COVID, I think you can look at that intersection between homelessness and COVID through two areas. The first is, what do you do about physical distancing, which, David, I think is your main question. And then a second question is, what about people that are going to be dislocated, or that already are, and are going to continue to be dislocated by the shutdown of the economy and everything. And the second question, the quick answer is, there's going to be a lot more, and we can already see a surge in homelessness. But to get to the first question, what to do about physical distancing, you have to think about there's people in shelters and congregate living settings. There are very, private room shelters are very rare. Usually it's a dorm setting. It can be bunk beds. It can be mats on the floor, church pews and things like that. More sophisticated places have like little cubicles, but it's congregate living. And sharing bathrooms, sharing showers. Some programs have, for example, one elevator for a facility of several, a few hundred people, 300 to 500 people. It's really difficult to do physical distancing in those congregate shelters and things like that. What organizations have tried to do, like, for example, Camilla's House here in Miami, is tried to move people into hotels, starting with the most vulnerable. So there's been some of that to try to get the most vulnerable people, people with preconditions and things like that, into hotels. So that has happened, but for the most parts, it hasn't happened on a large scale. So you still have a few hundred people living in a set of buildings. And I've talked to one person who I know that's living there, and he's described things as pretty tense. You can imagine living in a shelter is pretty hard. Anyway, we're used to having our own space and things like that, but you don't get that in a shelter or a transitional housing program. But I think all that the kind of potential conflicts and tension that exists in a living situation like that just get ramped up when you're trying to clean off all the surfaces all the time and maintain social distance and things like that. But then when you look at the folks who are on the streets, how do you maintain social distancing there? The Miami-Dade County Homeless Trust and outreach teams from organizations like Camilla's House have been out on the streets passing out masks and hand sanitizer and things like that. And trying to move people off the streets into hotels. And I feel that moving people into hotels is the gold standard, for helping people shelter in place. And I think we have the resources to do that, and even the legal authority to do that. And there were arrangements made with hotels, but the number of people that have been moved into hotels is actually very small. The Miami-Dade County Homeless Trust I haven't seen any numbers recently, but what I saw in the Herald as of mid-April, I think they had something like 600 rooms, and they'd only put about 200 people in them so far. But in addition to what the trust and organizations like Camilla's House are doing, one thing I want to shed light on, and I think this story, there's a lot of critique of government in it, but also I think it offers us some hope, some of that light that Andrea was talking about. And that's been this really grassroots response in Overtown, led by really grassroots organizations like the Dream Defenders. I believe they were founded after the killing of Trayvon Martin. Other groups like the Circle of Brotherhood, Miami's Workers Center, the Struggle for Miami's Affordable and Sustainable Housing, and some other groups. Also, there's a doctor from the University of Miami, Dr. Henderson, Dr. Armin Henderson, who has also been doing a lot of outreach on the streets of Overtown, and delivering a lot of the PPE, masks, also food, clothing, also doing testing. The trust has done testing as well. But those community groups, they were already doing outreach in Overtown beforehand, and working with a church, St. John's Baptist Church. And so when this pandemic hit, they were ready to hit the ground. It's debatable if the trust was out there, before, if they were the trust. There's been a little bit of a rift between these two sides that's played out in the Herald. arguing about, who's doing a better job and things like that. But, Dr. Henderson and his group reached out to the trust and tried to work with them, but, his initial call was rebuffed. I'm sure some people have seen on social media how Dr. Henderson was actually handcuffed by police after he had done this, what I see as heroic work in Overtown, coming back to his home in Flagami. I'm not sure how to pronounce that right, but he was unloading tents and supplies from his van, and a police officer came by, and when he didn't have his ID on him, he told the officer that it was in his house. He got handcuffed for illegal dumping. But just to kind of get back to the light of the story, first a little bit more darkness. I think they had to shut down their operation in Overtown at St. John's because it wasn't feasible to run it there. They asked the trust to take it over. I don't think they have, but I went down there 2 Saturdays ago to drop off some supplies or some donations. That was early in the day. And by the time and it was very quiet, by the time I had gotten home later in the afternoon, those same young people that are in the Dream Defenders were leading a massive march that was in downtown on the Saturday. That Saturday was the first big day of protests, and really kind of shaking the world at the same time. And that was just really impressive. And this movement is gaining momentum. We're seeing some changes, so I see these things as connected. This grassroots response of mutual aid, and also this political movement kind of coming out of a place like Overtown that people often just see for destitution and addiction and things like that.
So Matt, let me ask you, you alluded to this about the pandemic and the accompanying shutdown likely to produce a bigger problem of homelessness, and yet governments are seeing less revenue coming in as a result of the drop in business and revenue, tax revenue coming in. Are we looking at a huge problem not too far down the road?
Yeah, so there's multiple levels of eviction protections from the federal level, the state level, and the local level, and they're running out at different times. So I believe at the state level, at the end of this month, so if people aren't able to pay July rent, they might be facing eviction. And I haven't seen any good data for Miami yet, but some researchers out of UCLA for Los Angeles are predicting about 500,000 households facing evictions when the eviction protections run out. And that's because they aren't able to access unemployment and things like that. And so Miami is about a third of the size of LA County. So, we might have, well over 100,000 households facing evictions when these protections run out. And there has been some emergency aid that's been made available. And what I've seen from, the city of Miami, they were prepared for about 1,500 or so households to tap into that aid. And they had to shut down after a day or so when they got well over 6,000 applications. So, I have been kind of following the stay-at-home orders very closely and not getting out much, but just in my own little neighborhood in South Miami around Sunset Place. I've done enough street outreach in my time to recognize people who are newly homeless with bags walking around that I didn't see in the neighborhood before. And so, I'm really kind of concerned that we could see a wave, a very substantial wave of new homelessness.
Andrea, let me come back to you if I can. And the murder of George Floyd, obviously on its own, was gruesome and painful to watch. And it's been an accumulation of cases like George Floyd's. But to what extent do you think the pandemic and its disproportionate impact on the African American community has fed into a more combustible mix that people were just so frustrated and outraged that it led to a greater response?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, as I was thinking about the confluence of events, that the the fact of the vulnerability of not just African American and Black communities, but also of Latinx communities, Indigenous peoples communities, experiencing that that vulnerability, right? And as Matt was talking about, in terms of the just absolute impossibility of protecting oneself and one's community, right? So we are all very, very privileged to be able to stay at home, right? And so you have, a disproportionate number of people who are, of course, having to be out in transportation, who are not getting protected, right? Who are facing these questions between, okay, so am I gonna be able to make rent, or am I gonna be able to, have food, or am I gonna need to risk essentially my health? And so I think, to get to your question, this point of frustration, right, and just the absolute boldness, right, and the kind of way in which these inequalities have manifested themselves and threatened our lives, right? It's so very clear, right, that again, as I was saying before, the devaluation, the dehumanization and devaluation of non-white bodies and of our lives, how that becomes so clear, right? And then we of course have a president who's a white nationalist, right? And so there's that. There's the way in which that kind of assault, that constant assault, is also, and it's as we see in the protests, these protests are multiracial, right? You have places with very small, Black populations that are protesting this, and so there's a way in which the pandemic again shined this light on the vulnerabilities and also on the inability systemically to address and protect citizens, right? And so the role I think that plays in people's lives, again, combined with the video footage, combined with all of these other factors, really has, and I think also offers perhaps hope and opportunity. I mean, we see this is a global phenomenon, right? So we see the protests that are we see images of George Floyd, in Syria, on rubble. We see images all over, and so I think there's a element in which we have to look at this as what is happening. Is this perhaps also kind of reaction to the rise in right-wing leaning presidents and authority?
And let me ask you one more question, if I can. For many minority communities, remote learning becomes a bigger challenge. Internet access is not available. They may not have laptops. If this has to continue, if there's either a second wave or the first wave never really quite ends, what impact might that have also on addressing the problems of inequalities?
Yeah, I mean, so I spoke to the kind of the direct health consequences, right, and the disproportionate number of Black and Latino and Indigenous people who are getting the virus and dying from it. But then there's that wave of how the consequences of this, economic consequences, educational consequences, are further exacerbating inequalities. And you can see this within education, of course. I mean, and some of us have seen this with our students, that there's the housing conditions, right? The access to the internet, all of these are economic, indicators, right? But of course, we cannot speak about economic indicators without speaking about race and ethnicity, right? We can't talk about that without recognizing how immigrant status impacts access, right? How it is that these deeply entrenched inequalities impact access. How this, as Suzanne was saying, how this is gendered, right? And so yes, all of these factors do come into to creating a situation in which in multiple sectors, right, you see these kind of warning signs where you can just see that this is a runaway train that is, that does not look like it's going into a great direction.
Kevin, let me come back to you. If there has been a silver lining of the tragedy with the pandemic, it has been this brief cleaner air and a cleaner environment because there's not as many cars out there, not as much pollution. And yet whenever they get back to normal and people are driving and things are moving, there may not be the resources available to address climate change. How do you see the impact of the pandemic on addressing the challenge of climate change?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think it gets to, and speaks kind of to what Susanna was saying earlier about how we need to, we need to rethink how we organize our lives. This is one of the things that the pandemic is drawing out. And, I think what's been, very telling, both about the way that we've sort of responded to the pandemic and the way that, a good portion of the population, one of the things that's amazing about sort of the pandemic response really is how many people actually did voluntarily, sort of wear face masks and, begin changing what they do and voluntarily, sort of stop going into public gatherings. I talked earlier about, sort of the predominantly sort of white anti-lockdown protests, and that's a small minority of the population. What's remarkable is how many people actually did, kind of come out to that. Not come out to that. What's remarkable is how many people actually did, sort of voluntarily begin to change how they interacted with each other and how they interacted with the world around them. But I think that one of the interesting things that we're seeing now, particularly when you layer the pandemic on top of the ongoing crisis of anti-Black violence, both in terms of physical violence and in terms of the long legacies of state abandonment of marginalized communities, of withholding funds for support, sort of for public health, for public education, defunding public health, defunding education in minority communities, over the last 60 years. When these begin to get layered on top of each other, what you begin to see is this situation where I think, this kind of resonates a bit with what Andrea was saying, where, people really start to question, what is the role of the state? And we're beginning to see, sort of state-society relations being challenged in fundamentally, sort of novel ways that I don't think we've seen before. And so, what we're seeing now is that, we're seeing, sort of a larger questioning about what the competencies of the state are and what they can be. When you have, sort of state government that continuously sort of lies and misdirects about, pandemic numbers, that where people, sort of scientific experts are resigning from various health boards and data boards that, are, because they can't just sort of present the data, they're always being asked to sort of cook the books, as it were. We're seeing the national government just completely ignoring sort of the pandemic here in the United States and, effectively pretending like nothing's changed at all. And that we're going back to business as usual. People are recognizing that, the role of the state that we thought, the state would provide some sort of like welfare, which is a very sort of white sense of the state, the idea that the state government can help, sort of promote the well-being of the population. Even that sort of facade is beginning to, sort of collapse. We're beginning to see fundamentally new sort of ways of thinking about what demands should we be placing on the state? How should we, what should we look for the state? And so we're seeing like, the rise of like the autonomous zone in Seattle, for example, is a fascinating example of some of these, sort of autonomous movements where people are reinventing, kind of on the fly, how they can and should, kind of live together. And so now, what we're seeing more and more, I think, and I think this is what the pandemic layered on with the, with the crisis of anti-Black violence is revealing, is that, people are now seeing the role of the state over the past 50 to 60 years has begun to shift even more to promoting the economy, where the role of the state is simply to secure the economy. We're seeing, in Miami, we have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has just announced public comment on a $5 billion flood wall along Miami. And they're very explicit. They say, the purpose of this $5 billion flood wall is first and foremost to protect property value. And so, that's very clear up front, what the interest of the state is. You have stuff like that. You have stuff like the Lieutenant Governor of Texas going on newscasts a couple weeks back, sort of saying that old people, elderly people will be happy to sacrifice themselves for the economy. You're now seeing, sort of, again, sort of the facade of this idea that the role of the state has been to facilitate the wealth of the population. The role of the state has been to facilitate sort of the well-being of the economy. And when we say the well-being of the economy, we're meaning, basically the investment portfolios of the financial class. And this inevitably ties back into, sort of the 400-year history of white privilege, where, sort of the privilege to command the state, the privilege to command state resources, to dedicate state resources towards the securing of your sort of investment portfolio, whether it's in various sort of stock markets, capital market investment instruments, whether it's in real estate. This is what we're seeing very explicitly, that now state resources are being dedicated to these kinds of activities rather than sort of putting them towards securing the health, the well-being, sort of public health concerns, environmental justice concerns. We're not seeing that. I think it's becoming very clear exactly what the role of the state has become in our society, and that's where people are beginning to challenge and push back on that.
We've got a question here, Matt, for you, I think, and it comes from Rebecca Young. And she asks, what do you think of the idea of housing as healthcare? Do you think COVID-19 could lead more people to recognize housing as a right out of necessity and health needs? Thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Rebecca, for that question. And actually, if possible, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this too, because Rebecca is one of my PhD students who's been doing field work amid the COVID crisis here in Miami and looking at homelessness. So if you have any thoughts to add, things that I haven't covered, that would be great. But to address your question, of course, yeah, I definitely agree that housing is healthcare, and we've seen that with the treatments and policies towards addressing homelessness among people with severe mental health issues, and housing generally leads to better mental health outcomes. But getting the general public to acknowledge that and to see housing as a human right, and to get that kind of into our legal system and to become a reality, of course, takes a lot of work. But I think, yeah, this might be one of the positives that come out of this, that people might understand more that these pandemics can really hurt people who don't have access to housing, and so that might lead to more kind of broad popular support for providing more housing and addressing the affordable housing crisis. But it's a really big systemic problem. And so much, all aspects of inequality in our society need to be addressed, to really kind of eliminate homelessness. But also, one maybe gray side of this is that, when these hotels were kind of being arranged to take people who were homeless and vulnerable to COVID, there was just widespread NIMBY all over the place. People did not want people who were homeless going into a hotel near them, near their residences. So, it's not just a snap of a finger thing where people, become sympathetic.
Great. Thanks very much, Matt. Rebecca, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. Rigo, if we have the ability to let Rebecca chime in. We won't be able to see her, but if you want to add anything, Rebecca.
Hi.
Rebecca, go ahead.
Oh, can everyone hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the chance to comment. Yeah, what Dr. Marr was saying about the dangers of the congregate settings of the shelters. Like I've, been observing how Camilla's house has tried to social distance the people living there, but as Dr. Marr mentioned, it's very difficult without, your own room. And so stay at home kind of means something different there. And he also mentioned how Miami-Dade and some other cities and counties around the US as well have tried to move people into hotels. And there has been backlash there as well. HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, they've been releasing webinars about how we should use like COVID-19 as a chance to move more people into housing because, obviously of the health reasons there. I don't think this is something that the trust has commented on, but I do think there is like more of a recognition of housing as healthcare. But as you said, there may be some NIMBY pushback there. So
great. Rebecca, thank you very much.
Can I just jump in for a second?
Yes,
David,
please
I
go
just
right
wanted
ahead,
to add,
Andrea. Go ahead.
I just want to add also, because as we're having this conversation, just the question of the detention centers and jails and prisons, right? I think that those obviously congregate housing situations we have to bring into the conversation, and we know that there's an overrepresentation of non-white and working class people in those institutions, right? So what is happening there in terms of the spread of coronavirus and COVID deaths? I don't even know that we have clear data on that, right? So that, but we do know that they're tremendously vulnerable populations.
And sadly, a real breeding area for the virus, given its ability to spread. Absolutely, a very important point. I do want to come back, Suzanne, to you, and then I'm going to pose a question from Betsy Skip to, I think, Kevin, and then I'll ask each of you for quick closing comments. Suzanne, as you look out at the world, which countries would you say have made the greatest progress when it comes to gender equality? Which ones could be viewed as models in that area?
Well, I think these are in general countries who move towards a focus on a care economy, that on countries that value that kind of very that work that's necessary to sustain societies. And when Kevin talked about when he described the state that we live in here, which is sort of a protector of investment portfolios, right? And which is, I think, a very good description. That shows you that this state has actually never redistributed, or it's not a tradition that this state is in, and it has never taken the public care, wealth, and health and care fundamentally into consideration, I think. Okay, and when we talked before about states, the ones that you mentioned, they happen to have female leaders, but they also really, they have a structure of being a public force, a state as a public force that actually does things and pays for things for their people. So just as a little local dimension, I wanted to throw out, I think one thing that we should do also really in order to do something with systemic racism is we should make college for free. That's my conviction. I also come from a country where college is free. That would be a kind of access that is actually meaningful. I think that also would do something to college student loans, which are also race and gendered, right? So women and people of color take out many more loans and then have to work with them for much longer. And so just to come back to your, have to pay them off much longer and their lives are affected much longer, right? And to come back to your question of where countries have made the most strides in terms of gender equality, I mean, I think this is pretty well known that the Nordic countries are sort of at the forefront there. And that's what they do. I mean, they have a sort of a collective care system in place. They do have that, right? So again, I mean, Matthew talked about homelessness and so forth. I mean, in the degree to which families, just because they cannot pay rent, and not because it's their fault either, are thrown out of their houses with kids and everything. That doesn't have to be. I mean, you have to have a social structure that has, that provides housing allowances. You have to have an unemployment system that works. I mean, this is a ridiculous thing for a developed country that we have going here in Florida right now. I mean, those kind of things you have to have. And, that's an equalizer in society, not only for gender equality, but for other inequalities as well. And, Nordic countries, they know that and they have been much better at that.
Great. Thank you very much, Suzanne. Kevin, I think this question maybe is best directed to you. It comes from my friend, Betsy Skip. Can you address partnership systems and caring economic policies?
Yeah, of course, I invite other panelists to jump in on this one too.
Sure.
But I think, one of the things I talked about in terms of, economic policies that designed to sort of provide for and care for the population, it reflects the idea that, historically, at least, sort of for maybe like 200 years or so, the idea that, we can use resources, that state resources can be used and can be deployed to improve the health and well-being of the population. That we can invest in public health to, sort of improve death rates. That we can invest in public education to improve literacy, and that this will then allow the population to develop and to improve its sort of well-being. And I think, one of the most important things that, a lot of the literature on critical race theory demonstrates is that this way of sort of approaching public good has always been racialized. And so resources have always been dedicated towards improving the well-being of certain communities. And different kinds of resources have been dedicated towards sort of policing, quite literally, marginalized communities. And so I think the debates over, reforming versus defunding the police, for example, is a good example of, sort of some of these debates over what kind of state policies we should have. When you look at the resources that are dedicated to police departments across the country, huge chunks of municipal budgets are dedicated to local police forces, where, over the years, gradually more and more resources dedicated to education and dedicated to public health has been gradually scaled back. You've seen a concomitant explosion of funding for the police, for police services. And so I think in Miami-Dade, I don't have the exact numbers with me. I saw it a couple of days ago. I think it's roughly 28% of the budget or something like that. Don't quote me on that though. And so the question becomes, what do you do with these resources? You have resources. Are you going to dedicate resources into, sort of purchasing militarized, sort of military vehicles for the police? You're going to dedicate those resources to improving public schools. Where are those resources going to go? Then I think also, important thing to note is that when you begin, and this moves a little bit away from Betsy's question, I know, but I think, the question of what we do, sort of as a whole is, and, our part in sort of addressing these, and the way that we can sort of work collaboratively to build this together is, to recognize that these issues are not, especially when you get into racism and anti-Black violence, it's not about empathy, it's not about personal sort of or emotional qualities. This is structural. And so these are issues where, sort of racial inequalities are embedded in the way that we're socialized in a white supremacist society. And so I think, there's stuff that we need to do, that we can do in our everyday lives as academics, where we can, promote and cite the work of Black scholars, the work of critical race theorists, Latinx theorists, indigenous theorists, who have been working on anti-racism, have been working on abolitionist theory, and have been working on these kinds of, sort of partnership communities and what alternative futures might look like. They've been working on that for decades. And so, part of it is our responsibility to read and cite and publicize that. We also need to do the same thing promoting, our African-American diaspora studies programs at FIU, promoting Black studies programs in other universities, ensuring that they're properly funded and they're properly resourced. That's an important thing to do to ensure that we're able to keep these discussions going as well.
Great, thanks, Kevin. We are over time, but I do want to give each of you 30 seconds, 60 seconds, not to sound Pollyannish or naive, but I want to end on a hopeful note. We're facing enormous challenges these days. Andrea, if I can start with you, in light of all these challenges, in light of the problems we face with the pandemic, with racial inequalities and other things, give us a source of hope as you see it.
I think that what is happening now globally in terms of the protests and in terms of this kind of this outcry. Oh, whoops. Sorry.
We want to see you.
Okay, sorry about that. The kind of what we're seeing in terms of the protests and the outcry is actually, I think, obviously a source of energy, and it's a source of light, right? And one of the questions is, how do we then sustain this? What does that look like? I kind of took somewhat an issue with the photograph that was used to advertise this event because of the question of responsibility and taking responsibility for your community. Part of me felt like, yes, absolutely. And that's a source of also, I think, strength and hope in terms of looking at, like, if we look at Brazil, the state has abandoned these, favelas and, poor communities of folks of African and indigenous descent, and they're organizing and they're protecting each other, and they're, so that's wonderful, right? And then the other side of that, of course, is, well, what is the responsibility of, as Kevin was saying, what is the responsibility of the state? What is the responsibility of those other kind of members of society, right, to take responsibility for each other's health, as we saw in the protest, the anti lockdown protest. So I think that there's there is hope in this individual stories, right? And that I love this quote that I found. Somebody who survived COVID, a Black woman who survived COVID in California, said that, we turn moments into movements, right? So there's a really compelling, I'd love to see more kind of stories being told and more, as Kevin's, this is structural, so it's not about empathy, but I think that there's something to be said to giving voice to people's individual and community experiences. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. Matt, how about you? Source of hope. And you got to unmute.
Yes, I totally agree with Andrea and others that have referred to this, that we're in a very important moment, and we've got some momentum to kind of initiate some structural change. And I think we're seeing it with a lot of kind of especially the defund the police movement, and all of the research I've seen on homelessness and policing of homelessness, nothing supports the idea that we should have police at the forefront of outreach to people who are on the streets. And the police themselves do not enjoy trying to deal with homelessness. So that might be one area. I don't know if they would agree with the defunding aspect of it, but I think we should definitely get police out of that function of outreach to homelessness, because that just results in ticketing and moving people along and stuff like that. So that part of the movement I think has strong empirical support. But just to echo, I think Andrea and everybody else's sentiment that we have to keep this momentum going. And I would encourage people in the upcoming elections to look into affordable housing policies when you're voting, because that's kind of the core of the, it's another crisis we have, the affordable housing crisis, but that's, if you're concerned about homelessness, that's where you should direct your attention.
Thank you. Suzanne, Glimmer of Hope.
Yeah, when Kevin talked about the sort of white supremacist protests and their claim for personal freedom, and with that risking the well-being or even the lives of more vulnerable people, I thought that kind of rethinking, if you think about society as a whole, is going on, that or should be going on, and maybe more. This question of my personal freedom is actually really should be subordinated to general well-being certainly on a life-threatening level. I liked it a lot. I think out of that comes some kind of a collective responsibility for how we live and who we are, and it's inclusive. It's my freedom might be relevant to me, but it's really much less important than the lives of vulnerable people in our societies, right? So I think there was a collective dimension to it that I hope also in terms of, again, racial inequalities and many other inequalities that we haven't touched on today, right? That is something that those of us who don't feel that particular vulnerability themselves, they have to take into consideration. I think it could make us more collective, that situation, and more collectively sort of ethical and solidaric.
Okay, and Kevin, the last word goes to you.
Thanks. I mean, I think, I want to echo what everyone's been saying. But I think, one other thing too that gives me hope is that, we live in dangerous times, and yet, the white nationalist, the white supremacist playbook isn't working like it usually is. You can see these news coverage, you can read these stories about like these rural towns where people see these rumors that are drummed up on, from various sources on social media about Antifa coming into their town and all that. And then everyone gets like their pitchforks and their AR-15s and they go out, to defend the town. But, in the wider population outside of those bubbles that those communities live in, the standard playbook isn't working. And so it's creating a situation where, as Andrea said, these moments are becoming movements and events are spiraling out of control that typically, sort of the white nationalist playbook and the white supremacist playbook, is at least keeping pace or one step ahead. And, it's not there. And so, there's an openness within public discourse because, the media, the institutions that have been exercising sort of white supremacy, over the last, sort of decades, 100 years, 400 years, they're not keeping up with the times. Events are spiraling beyond, out of their control for the time being. And so that gives me a sense of hope that, that can continue happening.
Professor Kevin Grove, Professor Matthew Marr, Professor Andrea Quealy, and Professor Suzanne Zwingle, my sincere thanks to all four of you for joining us here today for a fascinating discussion on global inequalities. This has been a webinar series brought to you by the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series. My thanks also to my colleagues Pedro Bota and Rigo Campos for their great work on this, Amy Ellis, and others who have helped put this together. Thanks very much for joining us. We look forward to welcoming you on the next series.
Great.